Welcome to the Australian Hiker Podcast, Australia's longest running hiking podcast, downloaded over 1 million times worldwide and providing you with an Australian perspective on all things hiking. We're your hosts, Tim and Jill Savage, coming to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country.
This is episode 305, and today we're going to talk about sleeping bag liners. We hope you enjoy. Before we get into today's episode, if you'd like to help support Australian Hiker and this podcast, there are a couple of ways that you can help us out. Firstly, by subscribing on your podcast host of choice so that each episode is available as soon as it's published, and if you have the opportunity, leave us a 5-star review. Another way to support us is go to the Australian Hiker website at www.australianhiker.com.au and click on the Support Us page and buy us a coffee. You can do a one-off donation or become a monthly supporter. All donations are greatly appreciated and help us to continue producing this podcast and blog. Now let's get on to today's episode. Sleeping bag liners. What are they used for and why should you consider using them if you're into overnight camping? As the name suggests, their main use is as a liner for sleeping bags, but they are so much more and a very versatile piece of gear that many hikers don't even consider. But why should they? So what are they? Sleeping bag liners are essentially a piece of material, and the materials they're made out of do vary depending on what they're designed for and whether they're a commercially bought one or a homemade one. But they're essentially designed to line a sleeping bag. For me, my first interaction happened with them quite a long time ago. In fact, it was probably in my mid-teens that I used one. And this was with parents of a friend who were very much into camping and caravanning and had been using sleeping bag liners for a number of years. In those days, my friend's mother, who was fairly handy with a sewing machine, would take old cotton sheets, fold them in half and sew them along the bottom and the side to make a bag that would then be used as a liner for our sleeping bags.
I think everybody's mother did that at some point, if you were into outdoor things.
Yeah. The main aim was to protect the sleeping bag from mud and dirt, and if you've walked trails like Tasmania's South Coast Track, you know it can be very muddy indeed. Even if we stay relatively clean, we naturally produce oils and sweat on our longer hikes, and we don't stay as clean as we would do at home. So between what we produce from our bodies and the dirt we pick up on trail, it potentially can impact the performance and durability of sleeping bags because the grime from our bodies soaks into the bag itself, and this is where sleeping bag liners come in handy.
That's sounding really gruesome now, Tim.
It does. Now, what can they be used for? And the first one, as mentioned, is as a sleeping bag liner. And this is where the most basic form of a liner comes into play. It's designed to keep your sleeping bag clean. And with that, it helps to increase the durability of the bag itself.
Yeah, so the thinking is that it's easier when you get back home to pull the sleeping bag liner out, throw that into the washing machine, dry it quickly. And that's a much shorter process and also perhaps a little bit more hardier, durable product than having to wash your sleeping bag every time you use it.
And certainly we do wash our sleeping bags, particularly after a long trip and a long muddy sort of trip. But, you know, if you're just doing an overnighter here or there and you get a lot of mud and dirt in it, you don't want to have to be doing this every week or every couple of weeks.
Yeah, that's right.
Use number 2 is as a thermal layer. And if you only ever camp in one climate at the same time of the year and the overnight conditions are identical pretty much every time you go, you can pretty much purchase a sleeping bag that is going to do exactly the job you need. But for most hikers, this probably isn't going to work. I mean, for me, I've camped in the middle of summer. I camp in I don't camp in snow, but certainly I camp in the middle of winter time.
Sometimes it feels like that, and we have camped in snow.
We have camped in snow, but no, we don't plan on it. And this basically means we either need multiple sleeping bags to cope or some sort of layering system. In the case of a thermal sleeping bag liner, this is actually layering your sleeping bag. I won't say you've got a sleeping bag designed for hot conditions, but you might have one that's designed for -2 or -3, and then you're camping in -6 or 7, and the choice is to either up the clothing you're wearing inside the bag or add a thermal layer.
I do both.
Yeah. So it provides a bit more versatility through there. The other option is as a standalone sleeping bag. Now, I've had some nights where the temperature hasn't dropped below 20 degrees Celsius. And for me, I prefer nighttime temperature to be around about 15 degrees to get a comfortable night's sleep. So when it is really hot, I think most of us have done that. They've gone through summertime, it's been a really hot night, and you struggle to sleep. So the last thing you want is an ultra warm sleeping bag. And if that's all you've got, you potentially can flatten it out to a single layer if the bag allows. But even then, it's going to be a bit of overkill.
And also when it's really hot and, you're using your standard commercial sleeping bag, the bag against your skin feels a bit tacky, not because you're sweating, which you probably are. It's more so because the fabrics that the sleeping bags are made of at the moment are often quite synthetic materials. And so they just feel a little bit, dare I say, plasticky against your skin when it's really hot.
Yeah, and they do this for a number of reasons. I mean, partly you'll find that a cotton or natural fabric on a sleeping bag shell will provide a bit of porosity and allow moisture to get into the bag.
That's right.
So they're trying to minimise down or the synthetic fibre absorbing moisture through the shell of the sleeping bag itself. And as Jill said, it's a synthetic sort of material, and as a result, it feels a bit clammy against the skin. So having a layer that doesn't feel so synthetic just provides, it's a bit like having a sheet instead of sleeping directly underneath a doona or a blanket. It just feels a bit more comfortable. The other thing I'll say with using this as a standalone sleeping bag is if I wouldn't necessarily use one of the really lightweight sleeping bag liners. You may find that might work for you, but you'll find that the thermal sleeping bag liners, when you see them, this looks like I suppose probably the best way to think about them is a bit like a flannelette sheet. It's not quite as obvious as what a flannelette sheet is, but it's a thermal material designed to add warmth to the sleeping bag. But as a standalone in hot weather, and typically these sort of liners will have the allowance to put your arms out, not to have the hood up, and put your feet out the end of the bag. So you've got the ability to regulate your warmth in an environment where it's pretty hot and you just want something to go through and cover you. Last but not least, as a bottom sheet. In this case, I'll leave Jill to talk about this one.
Well, my sleeping mat, no matter which one I've been using, tends to shift around a little bit in the tent. So as a bottom sheet, what I do is I just insert the sleeping mat into the sleeping bag liner, and it does a few things. Firstly, it means I can sleep directly on top of the mat if it's really hot, and it also means that the mat doesn't move around as much in the bottom of the tent. Which is really good. And when we're sharing a tent, it's a little bit snug and Tim takes up a little bit more room than I do. It also means I don't end up being squashed on the side of the tent. I'm quite firm and stay where I want to stay as opposed to where Tim shifts me.
And it did surprise me when we were doing the written version of this podcast and the podcast itself. One of the things I discovered that when I was doing the research for the write-up and for the podcast, that Thermarest is one of the major manufacturers of sleeping pads, produce what is essentially a dedicated bottom sheet or a fitted sheet when you see it, designed to go over their sleeping pads. And they produce a few different sizes to match the different size sleeping pads. But it means that if you're just using a quilt or you've got your sleeping bag folded out flat, you can have this, instead of having a liner, you can have a fitted sheet over your sleeping pad just for a bit more comfort.
That sounds like a really good idea. I think the other benefit about putting your pad inside your liner is also that it suppresses the noise a little bit as well. So if you've got one of those really noisy sleeping pads and you're annoying your hiking neighbours, this is a great way to minimise that noise.
Now, if you were going to use this and use one of the dedicated bottom sheets or fitted sheets for these sleeping pads, you'd have to be pretty much convinced or know that you're only ever going to use that for this one particular function. Whereas you can always go for a sleeping bag liner, you can use it as a liner, you can go over the sleeping pad. You've got a number of versatile options rather than having a dedicated fitted sheet, which is purely as a fitted sheet. Now, with going through and choosing a sleeping bag liner, you've got a number of choices through here. And the first and most obvious one is to make your own. Now, as I said, my first introduction to sleeping bag liners were homemade ones through my family friends, and my friend's mum would take older sheets that are sort of getting towards the end of their life without falling apart, and basically fold them in half, sew along the bottom, sew along the side, and turn them into a sleeping bag liner. Now, a standard sheet from an Australian perspective is actually probably a bit on the larger size, and you may not need to actually go that large. So you may trim it off a bit shorter than that lengthwise and maybe make them not quite as wide. So I'd be inclined to look at your sleeping bag. It's no good having a sleeping bag liner that's much bigger than the space inside the sleeping bag. It's just going to end up being a bit of wasted space.
Yeah, that's right. You do need to have enough space that you can move around a little bit. You don't want to be too constrained. One of the downsides of commercial bags is that they tend to be sewn right up to the top, so it's basically a tube that you're getting into. If you make your own, you can actually adjust the side sewn length. You could put some Velcro on the side. You could really tailor it to something that suits you. And I know for me, being able to open up the side would be a great advantage to having a sleeping bag liner, the way you can when you've got your sleeping bag open.
Now, at the time of this podcast, a standard Australian single sheet, and again, I know this varies depending on where they're made, but the standard Australian sizing is 180 centimetres wide and 254 centimetres long. Now, that's a long sleeping bag liner. I think, from my perspective, if I'm using a sheet, I'm not going to worry about putting a hood into it, although you could actually do that. So for me, realistically, probably something as probably about 190, maybe 200 centimetres long would probably do me. And 180 centimetres wide, if you fold that in half, that's 90 centimetres. Most of the commercial sleeping bag liners on the market tend to be a bit narrower than that. But the ability you've got is you might decide to taper it and have it a bit wider at the top and a bit narrower at the foot box, and that's purely personal preference and depends on what your sewing skills are like. I don't think I'd want to be doing this by hand, although I'm sure people can. I think sewing machine's going to make this much easier. The other option is to buy a commercial sleeping bag liner. And we've actually gone through and reviewed a couple of which we both own and use. But certainly in the Australian market, Cedar Summit tend to be the main company that produces them. And they do produce a number of liners. These liners will vary in cost, weight, and thermal properties. So you really need to decide what features you're after. Are you after just, so if you're not going to make your own liner and you want purely the lightest weight liner you can get, you might opt for a silk and cotton liner. And you can still buy straight silk liners, which are fairly expensive. And that's what they used to be made of. These days it tends to be silk and cotton. The problem with the straight silk liners, if you get hot and sweaty, they can be a bit clammy, whereas the silk and cotton combination just sort of gives you the best of both worlds. They don't feel so clammy against the skin. So they're a good option through there. And the one we've gone through and reviewed weighs only about 172 grams, so it's fairly lightweight.
Yeah, that's right. So I think it's just really about working out what that temperature rating, that's one of the key things that you need to be thinking about when you're selecting your liner.
The other option is if you're going for warmth, then you're going to look at something like, and one of the ones we've gone through and reviewed is the Thermalite Reactor Extreme liner, which is also from Cedar Summit. Now, this is a heavier liner. It comes in at 342 grams, so it's roughly twice the weight of the cotton
and worth
silk one.
Every gram, if you ask me.
It does have a hood. You do have the ability to put your arms out while keeping the rest of it on. You do have the ability to open up the bottom of the liner to, if you really want, and there's an image on the write-up of the written version of this, where you can open up and walk around camp if you really decide to want to wear it on warmer days.
That's just weird and looking for an accident looking to happen, I think.
But in this case here, 342 grams is almost half the weight of my sleeping bag. So it's, do you really want to add the additional weight? However, if you're after warmth, the
Yes.
answer is yes.
Yes.
Now, the previous versions of these sleeping bags from Cedar Summit would actually say this liner will actually increase the warmth of your sleeping bag by 3, 4, 5 degrees, whatever the measurement actually was. Now, I know by looking at them now, they do not tend to say that anymore. It's just that it will increase the warmth of the bag.
To some extent.
To some extent, yeah, because it really does vary. I know I've talked to people in the past about these and they say, yeah, it doesn't really seem to increase it by that much. But certainly from my perspective, in fact, from our perspective, yes, in cold conditions, it's definitely worthwhile taking. And in my case, if I'm hiking in the middle of winter, yes, I will take the thermal liner. If I'm hiking in the middle of summer, yes, I will take the lightweight liner because and I may even end up sleeping in just the lightweight liner if it's really hot. My comment here would be is that you want to go through and cater for the coldest conditions that you are going to come across. So if the forecast for a 4-day hike and you're going to have 20 degrees every night, you can get by with probably just either the thermal liner only, or maybe even the silk liner, silk and cotton liner if you're feeling really warm. But if they say that, okay, 2 of the nights are going to be 20 degrees and the other 2 nights are going to be 12 degrees, you probably do want to carry a sleeping bag with you. And the issue tends to be with a lot of this is, do you just own one sleeping bag or multiple sleeping bags? We own multiple sleeping bags, so we can pick a lighter weight sleeping bag. But in all honesty, neither of us own a sleeping bag that's designed for 7 or 8 degrees. And I think you're either going to be camping in those conditions only, and that's why you own one of these, or you've decided to opt for a really cold weather sleeping bag and a really warm weather sleeping bag. But even having said that, getting a sleeping bag that's going to keep you comfortable at 7 degrees means that if it is 20 degrees, you're still going to be hot in it. And this is where one of these thermal liners really does come in handy. Just as a final word, most people would say that this is an unnecessary luxury. However, from my perspective, I've been using this since my late teens and always will do. I've never gone on a hike where I haven't taken a sleeping bag liner with me, unless I'm actually sleeping in a liner, in which case I haven't taken a sleeping bag. But if I'm sleeping in a sleeping bag, there's always a liner that comes with me. Think of this as a versatile piece of overnight equipment that will not only improve your camping enjoyment, equally importantly, it will prolong the effective life of your sleeping bag, which is typically one of the most expensive pieces of gear that hikers will own. Now, my oldest sleeping bag, which I only got rid of, it was probably about 2 or 3 years ago, was probably 40 years old.
Oh.
Now, a lot of it had lost a lot of its thermal properties, but over the years.
That's one of those ones we shared with our family, young kids. It's okay for them to be cold as opposed to us being cold.
Yeah, but it was one of those bags that you just found that, okay, I could have saved it for a summertime sleeping bag, but it wasn't useful as a wintertime bag.
And it was bulkier because, 40 years, Tim, technology's moved on a bit.
Moved on. Okay, we hope this has been an education on sleeping bag liners and you've gotten something out of this. That's all for this week. Bye for now.
And bye from me.